Welcome everyone to the Bodybuilding Dietitians podcast. Thanks for joining us for another episode with myself, Damien, and Lauren. So another comprehensive sort of guided episode today, and one that I've been looking forward to. I think the protein and the carbohydrate episode very much kind of, I think for the most part, like what we'd expect from those two macronutrients. And I think dietary fat, which is today's topic, is probably underappreciated, and there's maybe even a little bit more nuance around dietary fat compared to protein and carbohydrates. And I think maybe part of that is just because fat is spoken about less on social media and through other forms of content. And therefore, I think there's a lot that is underappreciated and just not discussed as much. So around like why fat is important, how does it relate to lifters, and also to general health as well, and how should we be using sort of that information to guide us day to day and to help with our health and dietary fat sources and things like that. So yeah, as per usual, we'll get into a bit about sort of why it's important, what it's used for in the body. So I might let you start that off, Lauren, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so healthy fats play a really, really important role in the body. And as Jack said, it is often quite overlooked from a lot of athletes. They support so many things like brain health, hormone production, cell function, heart health, and the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins as well. So such as A, D, E, and K. So fats aren't something that we want to completely avoid. Like, they're definitely an essential part of a very healthy diet. But the type and the quality of fat really matters. And a lot of people, I find, are still getting a very large amount of their fats from saturated fat sources, like processed meats and fried foods and, full fat dairy, a lot of it, butter, cream takeaway, all that sort of thing, without sort of really thinking about whether those fats are coming from, where those fats are coming from or how they may impact overall health. So the goal isn't just to eat fat or avoid fat. It's to kind of focus on including more quality fats, such as unsaturated fat sources like olive oil, Jack's favorite, avocado, nuts, seeds, oily fish, while sort of being more mindful of how much saturated fat in some contexts is coming into the diet overall. But it's also important to note that saturated fat is quite demonized, but we still do need a small amount of it. It's just, as always, as I love to say, context dependent. Overall calories and what percentage of saturated fat is making up your overall fat sources. So
yeah, really good start. I think the other interesting part is we have essential fatty acids. We don't have essential carbohydrates, although I think maybe in the future, I wouldn't be surprised if they start labeling fiber as essential for health. But we'll see if that ever changes. We also, of course, have essential amino acids, and we do have essential fatty acids. So, and that's, I'd definitely echo the points around like fat-soluble vitamin absorption and hormone health. And I think that's where especially starting to get into some of the more sort of practical components of that, we do get into trouble in certain individuals at times where they start to go low on the fat. And I think that's, again, due to sometimes the overexpression of protein and carbohydrates where, okay, more protein is better, more carbohydrates are better. So therefore, fat is that sort of dial that people turn right down to almost zero at times, and less fat is better. Like, I'm going to be able to eat more carbohydrates and be a better athlete and get better results. Or even whether it's due to like, okay, carbohydrates and protein, they fill me up more in a deficit and they're the more enjoyable food sources at times maybe, and therefore my fat's going to be 10 grams, 15 grams, 20 grams a day instead of maybe where it should be hovering around. So is there a range that you sort of advocate for, Damien, from that sort of sufficiency standpoint?
Yeah, I guess there's very much from what I've seen in terms of research and kind of basing what the research says on, there is definitely a flaw from like that total fat intake that we want to have throughout the day. And it's, from what I've seen, like anywhere from that like half a gram, like 0.5 of a gram to 0.6 of a gram per kilo of body weight. And like we don't really want to be going below that amount, because as we've kind of touched on before, like how important it is for overall health. But even from a lifting perspective around supporting testosterone, and that's obviously going to be helping and supporting muscle muscle growth in as lifters when we do want to be gaining as well. So I try not to go below that, especially even more so in a dieting phase as well. I think it's really important to really ensure that we do have some dietary fat within that sort of phase, because it can support those kind of hormonal functions and helps and supports cardiovascular health, brain function, all those kind of things we've touched on before. But I guess there's the opposite end of that with people of, okay, well, what's the ceiling? How high can we go? And I think it is really, really individual dependent. It depends on the phase that they're in, depends on person's preferences. It depends on their training status or even training environment, frequency, intensity, these sorts of things as well. And it's very individualized around that. But, I think with training in particular, and even with resistance training, as you kind of touched on before, Jack, like protein and carbohydrates, especially carbohydrates, get a lot of attention in and around training. So then the most natural thing for people to do is, drop fats low, keep carbohydrates high. But we know during a resistance training, program, or just resistance training in general, it's not that glycogen demanding. So, I think when we have an abundance of calories and we're pushing up carbohydrates to +6 grams per kilo of body weight, and we're keeping fats super low, that's going to impact then hormonal function and potentially even muscle growth as well. So I think there's definitely some room where calories are plentiful to really try and align, maybe fats coming around 1 gram per kilo of body weight to really align with those kind of hormonal functions like we said before.
Yeah, and on that topic as well, I wanted to, and I totally agree with those ranges as well. I think beyond 1 gram per kilo of body weight, that's maybe a bit more, as you mentioned, circumstantial. And if someone is maybe on a super high intake of calories, or they're reached a point of diminishing returns with their protein and carbs, then they can choose to maybe go higher on fat, which I've discussed before that I certainly do. I have 120 to 150 grams of fat a day. So quite a high amount. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that though, in terms of just there is a bit of a narrative at the moment, and it's nothing new, where we know that in order for protein and carbohydrates to be converted to body fat, it has to undergo a fairly energy intensive process. It's not a process that is easy for the body to undertake. Whereas if you eat dietary fat, it gets stored as fat. That's a pretty simplistic way of saying it. So it's a very energy efficient process for the body to undergo. So, and I think that's why people like to also bias protein and carbohydrates, is that they have to undergo de novo lipogenesis to be converted to body fat. And I think mechanistically that makes sense. Do we have sort of clear research indicating that in terms of overfeeding studies? Some people do quote certain overfeeding studies around overfeeding on protein versus overfeeding on fat, and there is potentially some difference there. But I would say, again, it comes back to the magnitude of the surplus that someone is in and around someone's circumstances and preferences. What if someone doesn't want to eat, overfeed on protein, and what if they do want to have a little bit more fat and have some of the beneficial dietary sources of fat, which we're going to talk about a little bit more towards the end of this episode. Because I'll relate this back to my N=1 case study, but I don't want to be eating 800 grams of carbs a day and lower my fat. And there are other people in that circumstance as well, or maybe people are on the inverse of that. So again, reinforces just, this is the sort of work we do with clients on a day-to-day basis, is apply these sort of nuts and bolts and variables to everyone's personal circumstances and what their goals are as an athlete, or someone just looking to optimize their own variables and get as much out of their nutrition and lifestyle. So yeah, moving on to, we kind of skipped over this point, but I want to touch on the different sorts of fat. So I might let you just even mention what they are, Lauren, around mono and poly and trans fats and stuff like that.
Yes. So there are many different types of fats. So we have monounsaturated fats, and these are generally considered heart health supportive and are easy to include in your diet, actually. So examples would be things like olive oil, avocado, certain nuts like macadamias, almonds, peanut butter, that sort of thing. And they are quite useful, or fats in general, actually, this is another point, are quite useful in bodybuilding. They're very calorie dense, so they're easy to add in, and into a build phase particularly, and can also improve meal satisfaction as well. So, but that's just, an additional point just for fats in general. And then we have polyunsaturated fats, which include your omega-3s, like your oily fish and your plant sources like chia and flax. And then you also have your omega-6s as well, which is often found in nuts and seeds and plant oils and things like that. So polyunsaturated fats are important because they play a role in brain health and heart health, cell function, inflammation, etc. Omega-3 fats in particular are your ones that you've probably heard of, like EPA and DHA from oily fish particularly, and are often spoken about because of their role in cardiovascular health and potentially supporting recovery and inflammation as well. So omega-3s are often discussed, I hear, quite a lot because of their role in inflammation and cardiovascular health. And I've also heard potentially muscle-related outcomes as well. But I think the evidence for omega-3 directly, I heard this the other day, for directly improving hypertrophy is not strong enough to treat them like kind of a muscle building supplement. But they are still valuable for general health, especially if someone's diet lacks oily fish or omega-3 rich foods. So, and that sort of, I guess, leads me to the point about omega-3 supplementation, particularly if you don't eat, oily fish regularly, or if you eat fish maybe less than 2-3 times a week, which is, I'm in that camp. I just don't really eat a lot of oily fish. A lot of my clients don't. Maybe if you don't like seafood, or if you're plant-based, maybe you might consider something like an algae-based omega-3 or something like that. If you're someone who doesn't eat a lot of oily fish, and I think we've spoken about this quite a couple of times on podcasts in terms of omega-3 supplementation, but it's sort of looking for an EPA and a EPA and a DH amount, not just the fish oil amount on the bottle. So anywhere sort of between 1 to 2 grams, in my opinion. I take a Blackmore's triple strength one, and I think you do as well, Jack. Just cover that basis. So yes, omega-3s are quite important, and you can get them in supplement form. And then you have things like saturated fats, and they do get demonized a lot. And in context, yes, they can contribute to high blood lipids, which is not very favorable from a cardiovascular point. And really frequent consumption of things like fatty meats and butter and cream and coconut oil and things like that, can have a negative sort of implication in that sense. I think the World Health Organization recommends, as a very kind of blanket rule, that saturated fat should contribute more than about 10% of total energy intake, for example. So I guess, but it does depend context as well, which we'll probably get into a little bit more. But particularly in the clinic, I see people who have a lot of blood lipid concerns, like hyperlipidemia or something like that, where they have high LDL and triglycerides, cholesterol. And when I do look at their dietary intake, they do have quite a large intake of saturated fats. And so I would be often quite conservative with their intake, and sometimes even aim for closer to 7-8% of total calories coming from saturated fat. But also look at their fibre intake and everything else as a whole as well. And then we've got the trans fats, which I don't really see too much added into foods these days. And they're generally the ones that we do want to minimize as much as possible. So they're often found in your very ultra processed foods, baked goods, and all those types of things.
Yeah, really well said. I think I want to unpack or give some of my own thoughts on omega-3 and omega-6, those being the essential fatty acids. And then, let's dig into saturated fat a little bit more after that, and sort of cardiovascular implications, which I agree I think from a broad perspective, we got to remember that things like even the Australian Dietary Guidelines, the USA guidelines, the World Health Organization, the Heart Foundation, like those are population level recommendations. And I think that's why some people can become quote those negatively, because ultimately they're trying to manage things from a population level, which is understandable, where it lacks some of the nuance that we may dig into a little bit more throughout this episode. But we also just got to toe the line a little bit as dietitians this episode, and remember, it's our scope of practice to talk about nutrition and not as much within a medical circumstance. So omega-3, omega-6, I think omega-6 in particular is one that is, people latch onto omega-6 as okay, that's negative, it's pro-inflammatory, when I think the ratio of omega-3 to a 6 is more important, and literature is sort of signifying that the ratio at the moment is it's more common for it to be like 15:1 of omega-6 to omega-3, which is really high when ideally we probably want a ratio of more so 3:1 or 4:1. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that omega-6 is inherently bad. Again, like it's an essential fatty acid, which means that we need it in the diet, but it's more so the quantity of it and the ratio to omega-3. So it's a combination of lowering your sources of omega-6, and I think that it's more so the sources of omega-6 which some people have more of a cause for concern with, which is understandable, like ultra processed food higher in omega-6, which is again contributing to that disrupted ratio. And then obviously, as Lauren said, omega-3 is harder and harder to get through the diet. Like there are some plant forms of omega-3, but then that's in a less sort of bioavailable format of omega-3. And a lot of fish is farmed these days, which means that it's lower in omega-3, it's higher in omega-6. And then supplemental forms of omega-3 often aren't really strong enough in terms of EPA and DHA to have a meaningful impact. So that's where things like the triple strength omega-3 is going to be quite beneficial to kind of upregulate that a little bit more. So I definitely recommend like a triple strength omega-3, and that way you're more likely to be able to actually reach. Because like, again, as Lauren said, like it's that actual number of the EPA and DHA. And I think you said 1 to 2 grams, Lauren, which I think, 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. And like looking at because I think I said this in a previous episode that I used to take like the big fish oil capsule because I was like, okay, more is better. But then when I looked at the EPA and DHA, like it was the same as like a smaller fish oil capsule, which is why like I now just buy triple strength rather than double the size. So yeah. And I think would you have any points on that, Damien, or anything else that we've been chatting about?
Yeah, no, I think you guys have covered it really, really well. I think I'd just more so reinforce the point you made around like the supplementation and just ensuring that the one that you do choose is around that's triple strength, because it's quite common for people to go for, I guess, the bigger one may be better, but it's also a bit more nuanced than that. Like kind of really have a bit of a look at that profile around it and ensuring that you're getting the right one to help best support your cardiovascular health as much as possible.
Mm. Yeah, and something I made a reel on recently was keeping your fish oils refrigerated or cold, especially in a country like Australia where it's exposed to heat and moisture, and it may increase the oxidization and may sort of increase the risk of your fat turning rancid, which is actually, instead of anti-inflammatory, it then becomes pro-inflammatory and pro-oxidation, which is not ideal. Not that it would have a major effect, it would just more so just negate the benefits of the fish oil in the first place. So yeah, I keep it in the fridge now, and it's an extra step to delve into the fridge and get it out, but it's become a habit now.
I do want to actually just quickly mention the ratio thing, just because I might have like a slightly different view on it. I think the ratio idea, and I'll have a lot of people ask me all the time, like, does it matter about the ratio? Like you get so much more omega-6 and 3, etc. And I think the ratio idea comes from the fact that omega-3 and omega-6 can kind of compete in some metabolic pathways. Modern diets tend to be more higher in omega-6 and lower in omega-3. But I think the problem is that the ratio can sometimes be a little bit misleading. Like someone can have a better ratio because they reduced omega-6, but that doesn't automatically improve heart to increase omega-3 adequacy while also keeping healthy omega-6 foods in the diet. Because I believe that reviews have often criticized the ratio as being of limited value, particularly for cardiovascular disease risk, because higher levels of both omega-6 and omega-3 can actually be associated with lower cardiovascular risk. So I did a lot of deep dive and research when the whole anti-seed oil thing came out, and sort of saw the nuanced discussion on that ratio come up quite a bit. So that's just really interesting because it's a common question I get.
Mm. Yeah, I'm not too surprised about that. And I think not the only, but like one interesting way of looking at the ratio is, as you said, like it's not just about having more. Like I think sometimes it reinforces just the lower intake of omega-3, because someone might even not be having that much omega-6. But if someone has next to no omega-3 in their diet because they don't supplement, they don't eat oily fish or chia seeds or walnuts, then like it's just going to off that ratio. But I agree. I think umming and ahhing about a ratio is probably on the lower priority list anyway for people. It should just be about getting more quality sources of dietary fat in general. So yeah, touching base on the saturated fat component a little bit more, like I think the general consensus, at least what it has been, is like saturated fat raises cholesterol and that causes heart disease, which is like broadly sort of correct, but it's also broadly sort of wrong as well. Like I think it's just lacking that element of nuance, and people often look at LDL as a marker for basically a cardiovascular disease risk. And we know that saturated fat intake raises LDL. So again, from maybe a more broader population level, like that's often what people might use as like, okay, your LDL is high, like maybe your ratio of cholesterol or HDL to LDL is unfavorable, and therefore like that's something that you need to work on with the help of a dietitian, is to lower your LDL and improve your HDL, which again, I think broadly saying that isn't really an issue. I think it's positively something to work on, but I think where it lacks nuance is like factoring in some of these other factors like APOB and lipoprotein A as well. So basically, like LDL essentially measures the mass of cholesterol carried in LDL particles, but not the number of particles. And ApoB essentially counts the number of atherogenic particles, which is technically maybe a more relevant sort of marker of cardiovascular disease risk. So I think in some extra nuance on a blood test, you might get your ApoB protein tested and something like your lipoprotein A. Lipoprotein A is like very more heavily weighted towards genetics, and it's hereditary. So if your often lipoprotein A will be a marker of, okay, this is how much attention to detail you need to be giving your diet around saturated fat and quality of dietary fat, and even things like exercise and other components over time. Because like if your lipoprotein A is high in your 20s, then unfortunately it's just the way that the cookie is crumbled for you. You need to have quite a lot of attention to detail there. And I'll even put my hand up and say I'm not on the high end, but I'm in like the lower, like the moderate end. So like I've got a history of cardiovascular disease in my family, so reinforces that like there are certain things that I'm doing even in a supplemental sense to help with like my lipid profile and ApoB and stuff like that. So would you add anything onto that discussion, Lauren?
I think fiber deserves a mention. It's protective in this kind of context, but it does work a little bit differently as well, particularly soluble fiber, because it helps to reduce LDL and APOB by essentially reducing the cholesterol absorption and also increasing the bile acid excretion. So foods like oats and barley and legumes and psyllium and fruit and veg and whole grains are all quite useful because they can kind of actively help to lower the LDL burden, but not just improve gut health. So that's what's quite useful about it. And I think there was a 2023 dose response meta-analysis, I think, found that soluble fiber supplementation improved LDL and APOB as well. So again, it's protective, but it does work a little bit differently. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely do a full episode on fiber, but 100%, I think fiber goes hand in hand with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, and that's very well established. And there's particular types of fiber which bind to cholesterol and prevent its reabsorption, which makes it really beneficial for lowering that. And that's why, like, I'm in some senses, and this is maybe, no, I don't think it's controversial anymore as a dietitian to say, but like I'm in favor of fiber supplements for that reason. Like if someone is just not having enough fiber and they're maybe past that point of intervention, then or if they're on the way to getting more fiber, then I think having a fiber supplement to assist with that, ultimately mechanistically it's doing the same thing from a risk reduction standpoint. It's maybe just not incorporating some of those other beneficial aspects that you get from foods. Like you may not get the polyphenols and the other micronutrients that whole foods give you. So anything that you mentioned there, Damien, like you don't deal too much with, I wouldn't imagine, like cardiovascular stuff at your clinical dietetics.
Yeah, I have worked on the cardiovascular ward at the hospital for a couple of times. And yeah, you do often see those sorts of people. I mean, it's very tricky to say. It's a hard one because, you know, is it dietary related? Is it, like you said, Jack, is it around family history? Is it other sorts of things kind of having on? And I think that's really where it's, you know, it is a much more around the bigger picture. And you could have, even like kind of you said it yourself, Jack, where you are trying to optimize things as much as possible, but you may just have like a family history of things. And that's where blood work and getting that extra support can definitely help, because, you know, you can be trying to optimize things as much as possible, but you may just be inherently at risk at cardiovascular disease or heart health diseases more than the other person, just because of family history and genetics and things like that. So I think in that clinical sense, though, it is, I like the kind of framework that you said, Jack, around the fibre supplementation and utilizing supplements where we can, because, you know, in that sort of sense with fibre, like something is going to be better than nothing. And I think utilizing things like that as a dietitian as at disposal, then it becomes one of those tools in the toolbox that you can use to help and improve someone's health and health markers.
Mm. Yeah, I guess talking about like what we actually recommend from a practical standpoint then is if we're not saying that, I mean, I would broadly agree with the recommendation that sort of saturated fat should be roughly like 10% of dietary fat calories. And that's something that I really try and follow myself. And I think to keep it in that particular range. And then I think where people can go wrong is like, okay, they're having these sources of saturated fat. The doctor has told them to lower it, or the dietitian has told them to lower it. And then they replace it with something that is maybe ultra processed. Like they replace it with a baked good, or they replace it with a glass of juice, which isn't the end of the world, but it's not quite the same as replacing it with a nutritious source of dietary fat. And I think that's, again, where some people can go wrong, is that we should be prioritizing more plant-based sources of dietary fat. So this is where we can maybe start talking a little bit more about the different sources of dietary fat. And I would say that has the more meaningful shift on kind of cardiovascular health in general is, yes, being cognizant of the different types of fat, but also the sources in which they're coming from. So like nuts, seeds, nut butter, extra virgin olive oil, of course, avocado, olives, all those different. I think dairy more broadly like is okay. Again, it's anything that's more animal based is going to be a bit more saturated fat dominant, which just comes into that range that we've been talking about. Anything else on that point, Laura?
Yeah, I think it's definitely good to, I guess, give the listeners some practical takeaways for improving fat quality. So the points that you mentioned are quite helpful. And I think looking at the whole diet pattern is a good place to start. So, you know, not one food in isolation per se, like having some cheese and chocolate or butter isn't really the issue. It's whether your overall fat intake is mostly coming from quality unsaturated sources or mostly from saturated or ultra processed sources. And I often say to people, like, swap rather than just remove. So for example, olive oil instead of butter sometimes, or avocado instead of butter or creamy sources, or salmon instead of processed meats all the time, or nuts and seeds instead of having chips every single day, or Greek yogurt or protein yogurt instead of some other cream-based options. And you don't need to completely avoid saturated fat, but it's worth being mindful of how much is really showing up in your diet. So particularly if you've gone and got a blood test and you have high blood lipids or whatever, and you're looking at your diet, okay, I have a lot of full fat dairy, you know, do you mind maybe switching to a lighter version or lower fat version? So yeah, that would be my main tips. And I think particularly for like mono and poly, like for example, you'd be like, okay, you know, if I want to add a monounsaturated fat regularly, it could be through olive oil, avocado. If I want to try to include a poly fat, maybe it could be through some seeds, or I might, you know, some nuts and sprinkle it over my oats or whatever it is. And then again, thinking about your fatty fish intake. So if you feel like you really don't eat much fatty fish or whatever, then could I potentially think about supplementing with the sure?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is one of those things as well where like you almost need to test yourself and measure where you're at so you can actually compare against a baseline, because it's not necessarily a level playing field, as we said. Like there's genetics do come in fairly heavily regarding someone's lipoprotein A and how that may influence their cardiovascular disease risk. So yeah, especially in a country like Australia, like we have the Medicare system, you can get a test done and look at your blood test result. Like we're very blessed to be able to do that here and compare it in another 6 months. So let's say you do get a blood test and your APOB is on the higher end. And that means, okay, these are my current sort of dietary patterns, or this is what I do from a dietary perspective with my fat intake. These are some interventions I could make with a dietitian such as ourselves. And then I'm going to test in another 6 months and see where I'm at. Like that's I think the gold standard way of going about it, rather than guessing, because someone could be having like what they think is a really good format or diet layout, when in fact there's maybe quite a few things that need to be done to bring ApoB down or some of those other markers down, and vice versa. Someone could be stressing themselves out for literally no reason. Like they could be having a good enough diet and it's not negatively impacting their cardiovascular disease markers whatsoever. So I think testing it, which I did recently, I got ApoB tested for the first time and my lipoprotein A, and I did that. It was about 3 months ago now, and it put some things into perspective for me and like reinforced to me that I got to be a little bit more careful compared to someone who has no family history whatsoever. So even though I'm someone who has always had like a quote unquote good diet. So yeah, from a practical standpoint, Damien, like any points that you'd reference there around dietary fat?
I think trying to get in a number of different sources, like not just using, olive oil as your sole source of fat, like trying to get it from, maybe for one meal, you might have a bit of extra sprinkle of olive oil over the top. And maybe the next one you're having a stir fry, so it might be some sesame seeds or some avocado. Like instead of just having peanut butter in your oats, maybe it's a handful of mixed nuts. So I think trying to get different fat sources rather than just using one sole source is going to be better, just from diversity and, different, nuts might have a little bit more fiber than what olive oil has, and, different sorts of profiles that way. So I think it's important to not just solely focus on, one fat source as your main kind of fat source, trying to get a bit of variety for those sorts of reasons.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And that's like another underappreciated point of like the plant-based dietary fat sources. Like they often contain some fiber, and like they won't be as per 100 grams, like they're incredibly fiber dense, but per 100 calories, they're maybe not as fiber dense as some of the carbohydrate sources, but there's still a really good opportunity to kind of diversify your micronutrient and polyphenol intake. Often dietary fat sources like nuts and seeds are high in certain minerals like magnesium and zinc and folate, even like poppy seeds, super high in calcium. So they're a great way to just broaden your dietary profile and get in different fiber types and stuff like that. So yes, people do definitely and ah about like the lectins and the anti-nutrients, but yeah, not something to be too concerned about in my opinion, unless it's like actively giving you a lot of gastrointestinal distress, which I think is pretty rare for most of us. So yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about a bit of a client intervention, which I had with a client who came to me after doing keto and carnivore, and like and we talked last episode, funnily enough, we talked about sort of carnivore and those sorts of more intense dietary patterns. But yeah, they came to me and their LDL was super high, their ApoB was super high as well. Like triglycerides were very high, and basically sort of switched to a dietary pattern. Like I'm very blessed that the client that I was working with was very receptive to making some fairly significant dietary shifts, because I guess the reason they came to see us at TBD was around sort of their cardiovascular disease risk. So there was already that sort of stage of change shift where they were ready to embark on a different dietary pattern, but basically shifted to a lot of the different concepts that we talked about here around the different types of dietary fat. We also will go into depth in a couple of weeks' time more about fiber, but made quite a significant shift around fiber, of course, going from something like carnivore into a more moderate fiber approach. Definitely needed to make that more of a transitional process, because being used to close to zero fiber to then going into a more clinical range of fiber is a shift for the gut. So that needed to be done in stages. But yeah, it's now sort of 6 to 8 months down the line and everything's back into a normal range, and digestion is a lot more predictable and more comfortable as well. So it's nice to be able to put that sort of stuff into clinical action. And I'd like to think, obviously I can't say this with certainty, but would love to think that it's meaningfully had an impact on their health, with those markers being in a more healthy position from a prediction standpoint. So yeah, I think that pretty much sees us out with this sort of guided episode. Like I'd love in the future to maybe dig into a little bit more like from a supplemental standpoint for cardiovascular disease. But I think that's almost going beyond what this episode's about. Like this episode is about dietary fat, but we just ended up talking a decent amount about cardiovascular stuff. So I think broadly, like 0.5 gram to 1 gram of dietary fat per day. Don't think that less is more, because it's not. Like you'll end up sort of you'll end up creating some negative adaptations to your endocrine system, unfortunately, as a result of that. And yeah, being cognizant of the different types of fat you're consuming. And again, if you're interested in maybe looking at some of the cardiovascular elements in more depth, then I think getting the correct sort of blood test is a good place to start, rather than sort of trying to guess where you may or may not be. So we'll head into our final question of the day, which is something that we learnt this week. And Damien, I'll throw it to you first.
Yeah, so for something that I learned this week, it's actually only happened recently, like the last couple of days. I ended up buying a seatbelt for the gym. I don't know if you guys have used one in and around the gym before, but like there's some pieces of equipment at the gym that I train at that has like a seatbelt built into it. And I've always wanted to get one just to try and help brace in certain movements. And I've been using it for the last couple of days, and it's been fantastic. It's been awesome, from like using it on like seated hamstring curl, leg extensions, that sort of thing. And I'm like, how far can I push using this seatbelt? It's like I feel like if I'm doing it on like a seated lateral raise, it's probably pushing it too far down into the spectrum. I don't want to be looking like that guy in the gym, even though I probably
on the calf
do.
press.
What's that?
On the calf press.
I don't know what that is. Lauren has to teach me how to do that. I've got no idea. But yeah, like just playing around with that, and just like a different way of helping with bracing and things like that. I've heard people using it on like the hack squat, so I might give that a go and see how that goes. But yeah, it's been a bit of an experiment this week at the gym, trying on different things.
Yeah, I've used it on occasion. I must say for myself, like because at rigs they have a seat belt for like the leg extension, and like I've always just gone back to the band, because like the band sort of, with the seat belt, like there's a little bit of give in the in the wiggle room, but I like having the band sort of forces you into that position. But the seat belt is probably, I prefer it for the leg curl though. I find it really good.
Yeah, because that's what I was using, is bands, and my bands, to be honest, just got super old, and I was like, I feel like something I need to like really pull myself into. So I've been giving the seatbelt a whirl, and it's been all right so far. So
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I've heard some people have success on the leg press as well, like big time. Yeah, you can double up with the belt and the seat belt, like the lifting belt, the seat belt.
Get the straps, get everything going. Yeah,
knee sleeve.
That's it.
Yeah. In terms of myself, like I was actually a little bit sick at the start of this week. Like fortunately, I've powered through, and I'm feeling fine for the podcast. But I had some big weight shifts when I was unwell. Part of it was maybe because I was away over the weekend, but it made me thinking, okay, like how much more metabolically active are we when we're unwell? Because like I had my usual day, like I didn't really change too much with my day. But then my weight sort of fluctuated by like 2 kilos, which is pretty unusual for me. Usually it's within quite a tight range. So yeah, I mean, from the just very, very broad research that I did, like it can be a fairly meaningful shift if you're eating quite a lot of food. Like it can be for a general sickness, like I think mine was just like a bad cold and a light fever, like around 10 to 15 more metabolically active, which if my maintenance is like 4,000 calories, then that's like over 400 calories of extra expenditure, which I didn't eat. So yeah, maybe that could have played into a bit of a weight drop, but I found that sort of interesting to look at. Like it's nothing new that our expenditure increases, but I think usually when we're sick, we rest, and therefore we kind of negate that sort of difference. But because I had a normal day, like I think it compounded in a sense. But yeah, I just thought I'd share that. How about yourself, Lauren?
Say Monday morning or Sunday morning, I woke up with a really sore throat, and I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
I ended up dodging it. So anyway, I think it's time for another space fact, because we haven't had one in a while. Now, obviously we have the moon, but scientists have actually identified objects called quasi moons. I don't know how to say it. And they're not true moons because they don't orbit Earth directly, but instead they orbit the sun. But they move in such a similar path to Earth that from our perspective, they look like they're traveling with us. But anyway, one of them is called, murder this again, Kamoa or something. And what makes it really interesting is that scientists, I think it might actually be a fragment of our moon that sort of broke off after an impact or something. So its surface, I think, appears to have kind of they call it like a lunar-like silicate material, which is why researchers think it could be maybe ancient moon debris or something like that. And China's Taiwan 2 mission, again, I probably murdered that term, has now arrived there, is planning to collect the samples and then bring them back to Earth by around 2027. So we may soon have actual material from this almost moon to test whether it really did come from our moon. Anyway, I found that really interesting because it is such a reminder that there are these massive things that are happening in the background of life, like space missions and hidden objects like orbiting near us, and mysteries about where things are coming from, while we're just going about like our normal week and stressing about emails and groceries and work and everything else. And it kind of actually reminds me of that, is it a meme or something where it's like, you are here in this pinpoint of the earth, like zooms out. It's like this stuff going on and you're crying in the shower about something. It just kind of reminded me.
Have you heard of the recent, I don't know how true any of this is, this is an evidence-based podcast, so I'm delving into gray waters here, but it's the files released by the US government on unidentified objects and people. I've listened to some podcasts. I won't say who the podcasts are because I don't want to mention other podcasts on here, but interviewing guests around aliens and all that sort of. I find it entertaining. I wouldn't say I find it informative, but it's an entertaining listen. I'll link it to you off air, Lauren. But I find the stuff around aliens pretty interesting / entertaining, because just from a purely statistical standpoint, surely they have to exist with how many planets there are in the solar system, and so it's just from pure mathematical chance. You're looking doubtful though.
Jack, come on now. Drones, aircrafts, balloons, satellites, sensor errors, weather phenomenon, military technology. I'm a very sciencey person. There's an explanation for everything, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm not saying on Earth. I'm just saying in general, on another planet, which obviously we haven't been to yet.
There's life on other planets. I mean, why not? There's life on this planet. So who's to say that there's not life on another planet? Aliens, and then the form that we see them on TV, probably not.
Yeah. And I'm definitely not saying that aliens are if I had to give it a black and white answer on aliens on Earth right now, it's a strong no from me, because I just think with handheld devices these days, we would have too firm sort of proof. But anyway, I'm straying way off the track here on the TBD podcast.
People always like to believe that there's something bigger out there than ourselves, but that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
TBD alien podcast coming soon.
Yeah. Or we'll have to do a Christmas special or something for that.
Perfect.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks to everyone for tuning in. Appreciate you if you stuck around here towards the end, and we'll catch you next week.